All right.
So we can share this later,
Yes.
if that's okay with everybody.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Technical difficulties. Okay. Well, I think we're all here. We're all present, right? Okay. Well, I just want to welcome everyone to the third in our monthly Q&A series, or speaker series, hosted by Justin Farrell, Kegley known for Congress. Tonight's session is all about the Cuban crisis, what's going on, how this started, what we can do to help, what we shouldn't do to help, open to all. We're thrilled to have you here with us, and especially thrilled to welcome our guest speaker tonight, whom I'll introduce right after some very light housekeeping. So we'd like to ask everyone here to kindly consider making a donation to our grassroots campaign. We're up against a corporatist entrenched candidate whose #1 source of donations is corporations and PACs, including Raytheon, which is a huge weapons manufacturer, and from the health industry as well. So here is the donation link in the chat, and it should be working now. If not, let me know and I will fix that. Because every little helps, and we're trying to raise green for green.
Yeah.
Okay. So that is all for housekeeping. And so now what I will do is introduce our guest. Let me just pull up that.
Hi, Patricia.
Hey, Justin. And
Hi,
everybody.
Hi, thanks for coming.
Oh, hi, Patricia. Yep. Sorry. Where's my trash? Okay. Okay. So tonight's guest is Henry Lowendorf. Henry has been a peace activist since the 1960s and is a member of the executive board of the U.S. Peace Council. He has coordinated numerous efforts to pass New Haven City Council resolutions, moving money from the war machine to the human needs of our communities. He participated in the Commission on Connecticut's Connecticut's future, aimed to examine conversion of Connecticut's war industry to peacetime manufacturing. Among many other international activities, he led a fact-finding delegation to Syria in 2016 and has traveled to Cuba on numerous occasions to participate in seminars on closing U.S. foreign military bases. Henry has a PhD in biology from Case Western Reserve University and served as Associate Director of Yale University's Office of Cooperative Research. He retired in 2007, it's weird to say, around 2007, to focus on promoting peace and justice. And he's currently the chair of the Greater New Haven Peace Council. And I'll drop their info in the chat momentarily. So I will now pass it over to Justin. We'll give some short welcome remarks and then we'll dive into the discussion.
Thank you, Sivan, for helping arrange this event tonight. Thank you, Henry, for coming. I know Henry through attending various peace demonstrations in the New Haven area, and I'm a big fan of his and appreciator of his work in the peace movement and for furthering the cause and raising awareness in that area. And you know, he's also involved in the New Haven Peace Council, which is one of the few peace councils of any city. Oh, Patricia's saying audio problems at my end. Can you hear me okay? So?
It's saying your network bandwidth is low.
Oh, hold on. Okay. Okay, hold on.
About needing.
Hold on 1 second, okay?
I just put into the chat the Greater New Haven Peace Council's website. So you can check that out. I see there's a couple of petitions people to sign. You can subscribe to their email updates as well. And it's a great website for information on peace.
Well, that's the New Haven Peace Council. And then there's also the Greater New Haven Peace Commission. Is that right, Henry?
It's actually the City of New Haven Peace Commission.
Okay.
They get confused, but they're very different organizations.
Well, one is a part of the municipal government of New Haven, and the other is more of a grassroots organization, right?
Yes.
So I just wanted to, I want to thank Henry for coming to speak today about Cuba. I know that Henry's been involved in organizing and participating in some recent car caravans that I'm sure he'll talk about to raise awareness of what's going on with the Cuban sanctions. I prepared some slides that I'm not going to share right now because I don't want to steal any of Henry's material. He's going to give some historical context. But I spent some time today digging deeper into the historical context of our relationship with Cuba. And if there's time at the end, I'd like to share some of my slides and some of the interesting things I uncovered about the history of US foreign policy towards Cuba, going back to when we won the Spanish American War and occupied Cuba, and then kind of forced this treaty down their throat, made these 7 demands in order for us to withdraw our troops, and that we've kind of controlled Cuba since. I mean, they've always been they were under control of Spain, and then they were under our control, and that never changed really until the Castro Revolution is when we became their enemy. Anyway, I think Henry's going to give some of that history, and take it away, Henry. Thank you all for coming.
Well, thank you, Justin and Sivan, for inviting me. I'm really pleased to be here. Even though I know a lot about US-Cuba relationships, I'm not an expert. There are other people who are far more expert. But I think I can give you a synopsis of what that history looks like, and also as Justin began to discuss, and also some of the things around current events. And one of the reasons that Cuba's in the news now is because of some events that took place in Cuba and then outside of Cuba on July 11th of this year. So let me get started. Just I'm going to quickly run through some things and see if I can do this in, say, 5 minutes, and then talk more about what's going on now and some things that we can do and spend more time on that. I want to go back to 1824. That's when James Monroe published his Monroe Doctrine. And the Monroe Doctrine basically said that the United States of America, then less than 50 years old, had proclaimed for itself that it owns Latin America and the Caribbean. That is, it can do anything it wants, and it's keeping the Europeans out, but it has control. And it acted on that many, many times on lots of countries. Now, jumping forward, as Justin mentioned, the 1898 Spanish-American War. Actually, Cuba and Puerto Rico and Guam and the Philippines, which were all colonies of Spain, had basically won their independence. They beat Spain, and the United States then stepped in to make sure that those countries continued under colonial control, but this time US colonial control. And it was a brutal control. In 1903, jumping ahead 5 years, Connecticut Senator Orville Platt added an amendment to some legislation in the United States that guaranteed the takeover of Guantanamo Bay, which is a deep water port in the South Cuba. And the United States invaded Cuba so many times and between those dates and installed a president, a dictator, into Cuba who signed this agreement that gave a 100-year lease to this deep water port. Don't confuse it with the city. There's a city called Guantanamo that's just north of that bay. But the US Navy controls that still. And after 100 years, the US refused to give it up. And the agreement said that both sides had to agree that the lease would end. The Cubans wanted it to end, and the US said no, so it continues. The Cubans consider it illegal, and I think internationally it would be considered illegal too, since it was imposed after the government had been overthrown. So there have been various invasions in the course of the next 30 years. In the 1930s, the United States installed Fulgencio Batista as the dictator, and he remained the dictator of Cuba until 1959. Cuba's economy at that time depended on sugar, casinos, the mafia, and prostitution for tourists. In 1953, Fidel Castro, who was a law student, led a group to attack the Moncado barracks in Santiago de Cuba, which is also on the south coast, because they wanted to steal weaponry to fight the Batista dictatorship, which the United States, as you imagine, supported in every way. And that attack failed, and there were many of the rebels that were killed. Fidel was arrested, he was thrown in jail. But after a couple of years, he and the remaining rebels were amnestied. He left for Mexico and regrouped. Che Guevara and others joined him. And they made it back to Cuba on the vessel Granma, which you may or may not know is the name of the Cuban newspaper now. And despite a lot of setbacks, they created a guerrilla force in the mountains in the southeast of Cuba. Havana is in the northwest, so there was a long distance to get eventually to Havana. But by January of 1959, Batista fled. The revolution threw him out. There were labor unions and political parties that supported this, and the people supported it. It was a great celebration. If you've ever seen the videos of Fidel and the guerrillas coming into Havana, it's really amazing. The United States made it very difficult for the Cuban economy. For example, it prevented Cuba from getting oil from for power from various sources. And the Cubans said, well, let's see where we can get it. And the Soviet Union offered to send oil to Cuba. And Cuba, in Cuba was a refinery that was owned by Texaco. And Texaco refused to refine this oil that came from the Soviet Union. So the Cubans nationalized Texaco. And that was sort of a repeated thing that went on as the United States and its corporations closed down, the Cubans took over. So eventually they ended up nationalizing a lot of the industry that existed there. US cut off sugar sales, refused to sell and buy goods, and even with these nationalizations, Cuba offered payment and the US refused. So in 1960, the United States initiated this blockade of Cuba, an embargo, sanctions. It has different names, but basically cut Cuba off from all of its suppliers and also cut it off from being able to sell. And Cuba found support in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. In 1961, John F. Kennedy had been inaugurated shortly before. The Bay of Pigs took place. This was an invasion of mercenaries, anti-revolution, counter-revolutionary Cubans, organized and trained by the United States. They were told, and the president was told, that these invaders would be received as heroes. Well, they weren't, and that invasion was defeated. I want to jump ahead again to 1976. The United States CIA arranged for a Cubana airline that was flying from South America with over 70 people on it, arranged for that to be bombed over Barbados in the Caribbean. Everybody was lost. On that plane was the Cuban fencing team, for example, but there were others too. There is now a monument to that terrorist act that the United States initiated against Cuba in 1976. And I should say, I just want to read something for you, because this is an indication of some of the things that had been done in Cuba. One of the first things that Castro and the Cuban Revolution did was send young people from the cities who were 5th, 6th, 7th graders, high school students out into the country to teach literacy. So before the revolution, literacy in Cuba was about 77%. That is, 77% of the population could read at a 5th grade level. In 2012, it was great. Since then, it's 99%. And 99% is a pretty high level. Cuba has among the highest literacy levels in the world. United States literacy level, as comparison, is about 79%. That is that 79% of our population can read at a 5th plus grade level, and the rest, no. That's pretty damning. But Cuba solved that problem very early on. So I'm going to read something from the National Geographic magazine, which did a story on Cuba in 1977. And they interviewed a rural family of 9 living in 2 rooms, obviously very crowded. Delia, the mother, says, "Our children can all go through school if they want, and we have enough to eat, and we like this better than living in the city." So they didn't live in great quarters in 1977. So this is 17 years after the beginning of the revolution. And then this article goes on. "Still, except for the obvious advantages of free education, medical care, and a salary, daily life has changed little for the Fernandezes." And that, to me, is an indication, it's a model of how the United States views Cuba. Except for the obvious advantages of free education, medical care, and a salary, not to mention housing at that time, nothing has changed. Well, that changes everything. But once you exclude those things, then you can say nothing has changed. So a couple of other points of fact. 638 assassination attempts on Castro, according to the CIA. And the CIA used the mafia, among other things, to try to assassinate Castro. In 1996, a law was passed in the US Congress that trafficking, called the Helms-Burton Law, trafficking in nationalized properties creates a stricter, basically allows companies to sue anybody, any company, anyone who does any business with those nationalized properties. So that strengthens the blockade on Cuba. Trump moved it even further, adding over 200 more sanctions to Cuba. And Biden has not reversed those sanctions. Now, I want to get into some things that are relevant today, and I'm going to talk about in terms of what some of the issues are. In 2000, but I'm not going to start immediately. 2005 was Hurricane Katrina that devastated New Orleans. Fidel Castro offered to send medical personnel to the US to help out, and Bush declined. But it led Castro to create what they called the Henry Reeve Brigade, which is a set of brigades, actually, of medical doctors and nurses who are tasked and given materials and whatever they need to go to countries that need medical help in emergencies. And often they go and provide medical help to poor countries, even not in emergencies, because many countries around the world, in Latin America and Africa and Asia, don't have doctors, or the doctors only treat the wealthy. At about that time too, the Latin American School of Medicine was created to train physicians from poor countries all over the world. And that ELAM is the Spanish acronym. Trains for free young people who want to study medicine from countries all over, the poor countries all over the world. But there was a US congressional delegation that went to Cuba about that time in the early 2000s. And one of the congressmen, I think from Mississippi, said, boy, we could use that in the United States. We have young people, our African-American students, who don't go to medical school even though they'd love to because they can't afford it. And Castro said to this delegation, I will give you 500 slots in the School of Medicine, which he did. And I'm going to talk about one of the results of that in terms of actions that and things we can do. But since then, there are over 100 physicians who've gone through this program. Everything is paid for. They even get a stipend. And they've come back, and the only real requirement was that they agreed to serve underserved communities. That was the only requirement. And that's what they do. They serve underserved communities in the United States and the other physicians. So there are 10,000. It's a huge medical school, and they've educated physicians all over the world. So one of the results of this blockade currently is that in the pandemic, and Cuba has actually managed the pandemic better than the United States, certainly, because the US is at the bottom of the barrel, but better than most countries, despite the blockade. But right now, it has an inability to resource syringes to give people vaccine. And I should say this, Cuba under Castro developed a biotech industry. This is something that Justin, I'm sure, knows about. A biotech industry that is really the envy of the developing world. And they have produced in several decades of biotech research and development. They have produced anti-cancer drugs and drugs to take care of, or procedures to take care of diabetic ulcers, medicines of all sorts, and treatments of all sorts. This is so unusual for a relatively poor country and a poor developing country. And then you add to that this blockade that prevents them from buying medicines and foods and selling goods. And since the pandemic, they can't even make money off of tourists. So this is a terrible situation. And the situation in Cuba is really dire right now. A few years ago, before Trump, it wasn't so bad. They were improving. There was a period in the 1990s that today is being compared to, that was called the special period, when the Soviet Union collapsed. And much of the support and trade that the Cubans did in the 1990s through its agreements with Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, much of that just disappeared almost overnight, and it threw Cuba into a really dire situation. The lack of food, lack of everything, fuel. But they made the best of it, and they came back. And Cuba is, it's not the poorest country in the world. It's prosperous in a number of ways. It's about the same prosperity of a country like Ecuador. So for the last 29 years, United Nations General Assembly has voted to end this embargo that the United States unilaterally imposed. And while this, and the most recent one was in June, 184-2, the votes in the General Assembly. The two were the United States and Israel. There were a handful of abstentions. But 184 countries around the world said the blockade's got to go. The United States has for 29 years ignored that. And in fact, I think the events of July of this year, demonstrations in Cuba, I think there's a relationship to those demonstrations I'm going to talk about in a moment. So we have this blockade that's really what is the content of the blockade beyond the Helms-Burton? It is and this kind of sanctioning hits other countries too. Venezuela is obvious, Syria, Iran, North Korea, and there are 39 or more countries that are sanctioned by the United States, some of them much more intensely than others, and Cuba is one of the most intense. But Cuba can't buy and sell things through the SWIFT international financial system because the United States controls that. And the US has a history of going after companies and suing them for big bucks, banks, for doing business with Cuba. So Cuba has found some ways around it, but still, it's a huge burden. It's a huge burden. And maybe you'll have some questions that I can answer about that. But I just think it's something, it's the most important thing that we can do in the United States is to put pressure on our government to end that blockade, to build support for ending that blockade. Now, on July the 11th, there were anti-government demonstrations in Cuba. And actually, that's overstating it. There were anti-poverty demonstrations in Cuba. There were thousands of people in the street complaining about the lack of medicine and the lack of food, the difficulty, the having to stand in line to buy food, and so forth. Most of these people were not calling for the overthrow of the government. In fact, a very small number was calling for the overthrow of the government. But in the United States, the message is that all these people wanted to overthrow the government. And in fact, many of the people, if not all of them, who want to overthrow the government are basically paid counter-revolutionaries paid by the National Endowment for the Democracy or the USAID or the CIA, one of these organizations that does everything it can to overthrow countries that don't fit the US mold. And the demonstrations in support of the government, 100 times larger, get no coverage in the United States, except when they take a video of a huge demonstration with Cuban flags and so forth that are supporting the government, and then they run a commentary by Senator Ted Cruz from Texas who says these are anti-government demonstrations. And they've done that over and over again. But different, not only Fox, but CNN and so forth do this kind of thing. So we can talk more about that, but the demonstrations in Cuba are demonstrations over serious problems, which the government acknowledges. It doesn't hide it. It doesn't say these aren't occurring. But the demonstrations, most of the demonstrations are calling for ending the blockade, and most of the demonstrators. In the United States, the anti-revolution, the counter-revolutionary Cubans, of course, want to overthrow the government of Cuba. They have very little support in Cuba. So let me just say, here are some actions that we could take. And then I'll stop. The most important thing is ending the blockade one way or another. We in Connecticut and around the country have been doing car caravans on generally the last Sunday or last Saturday of the month, as in a solidarity with car caravans that were actually started by Miami Cuban youth, calling for an end to the blockade because their families that's still in Cuba are hurting, and there's a change in attitude in the younger generations. The older generations that fled Cuba hate it and want to overthrow the government. The younger generations want to make sure their family are taken care of and live a decent life. So there are these car caravans. Second, we're asking people to urge Rosa DeLauro to publicize a letter that she signed in March that I think some 70 Congress members signed. I believe it was 70. And she was one. Basically calling to relax the embargo on Cuba during the pandemic and ultimately get rid of the blockade. And they sent this letter to Joe Biden. Joe Biden, however, has maintained the embargo, the blockade, and also Trump's tightening. He hasn't, in his campaign, he said he would reverse what Trump had done because Obama in 2014 opened up relations with Cuba, opened up diplomatic relations after recognizing that what the United States had been doing did not work. So Obama said, let's open up relations and see what we can do to change Cuba that way. But the Cubans welcomed that. And so for a couple of years, there were improving relations between Cuba and the United States. Trump reversed that, and Biden has refused to change what Trump did. The next thing is to support some of the work of a not so young man, Carlos Lazos. Carlos is a Cuban American who has done bike tours around the country and did a march from Miami to Washington, D.C. to publicize the damage that the blockade is doing and call for its end. That has gotten practically no publicity in the major media. They've ignored him. I'll call it censorship. The next thing is the Henry Reeve Brigade itself. It has been nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize, and I urge people to find ways of supporting that. And then the next thing is the Latin American School of Medicine. So there's going to be a graduation ceremony on the 27th of August at 8 o'clock in the evening, our time, that IFCO, which is Pastors for Peace, an organization that sends material aid to break the embargo and has been doing it for decades, sends material aid to Cuba and some other Latin American countries. And IFCO is the North American coordinator to identify young people here who would qualify to go and study medicine in Cuba. And they're holding a graduation ceremony later this month. And of course, traveling with IFCO or the World Peace Council or Code Pink or a number of other organizations to Cuba is something I recommend. It's a very interesting place to be. And when you get to talk to people and look at institutions, you see some significant differences. And then, of course, people are people. And finally, I think the Green Party should join if it hasn't already, it may be a member of the National Network on Cuba. This is something that is a very powerful solidarity coalition, and it's doing excellent work. So that's the final thing. So there are a bunch of things that can be done and should be done. The caravans we've done in Hartford, in New Haven, and Middletown. And I don't know where the next one will be, but it'll be sometime at the end of this month. So let me stop. I've taken more time than I thought. Always.
Thank you, Henry. Thank you so much. I would, before we open it up to discussion, I would like to share just a few of the slides that I made and try not to take too much time in delaying any questions or conversation. But let's see. I'm screen sharing, but I'm not sure what I'm screen sharing. What do you see?
Picture of Fidel and Justin for All.
Let's try it again. Wait. You can just do desktop and then,
There you go. Now hit, yeah.
okay. So thank you, Henry. That is, a nice overview of the history. And I'm just gonna complement that with the history overview that I came, because I think it's very important to look at the history here, because the history really tells you a lot about why people, I'm always interested in the motivations between US foreign policy. Why are we doing this? And the conversation is often ahistorical. We don't really go into, we talk about, oh, well, we're retaliating for this latest thing and tit for tat. But on a deep fundamental level, it's important to ask why, what's motivating the US here. And I think the history of our relationship with Cuba is really makes it clear what our motivations are, why we care about Cuba. And I think Cuba is, in that regard, is a very interesting archetype or microcosm or example of how the US considers other countries as so briefly. So there were the Taino people who were in Cuba, the natives from like 5,000 BC or maybe 4,000 BC to 1500 when the Spanish came. And let me do this so that I can. So the Spanish came and they held on to Spain for a long time. Held on to Cuba for a long time as a colony. But in the meantime, America had its own problems. We had our Civil War and stuff. But in the late 1800s, we started taking an interest. There's this guy, Alfred Thayer Mahan, who was in the Navy, and he wrote this really interesting document or essay on how we need to start looking outward. For the past quarter of a century, the predominant idea, which has asserted itself successfully at the polls and shaped the course of government, has been to preserve the home market for the home industries. So this is talking about economics, right? Our capitalist economy. It's safe to predict that when the opportunities for gain abroad are understood, the course of American enterprise will cleave a channel by which to reach them. So, and he's talking about, remember the name of this essay is the interest in America in sea power, right? So he's making a connection here between our military might and our opportunities for gain abroad, economic gain. I think it's all spelled out. It's all pretty obvious, I think, when you look into the details of the history, that this is what we're doing. This is what's motivating most of our foreign policy. And so it's kind of nice when someone kind of lays it out in black and white. To affirm the importance of distant markets and the relationship of them to our own immense powers of production implies logically the recognition of the link that joins the products and the markets, that is, the carrying trade, the three together constituting that chain of maritime power to which Great Britain owes her wealth and greatness. So this is America in the late 19th century thinking, hey, being an empire, being a colonial power worked really well for England. How did they do it? They had a strong navy. They went all over the world and set up colonies. And this increased their wealth because they could harvest the riches and resources of all these distant lands and the workers in these distant lands, and turn it into capital that would get concentrated back home. So in 1898, there was a war, the Spanish-American War. We defeated Spain. We took several, or as Henry said, we kind of reclaimed several of her territories, including Cuba. And here's us putting up the American flag in Cuba and socking it to the Spanish here and asserting our dominance. Here's a cartoon that was anti-US. Here's President McKinley putting a US brand on the captured Cubans. This is Platt, the senator that Henry referred to. So after the war, we occupied Cuba, we held on to it for 4 years, and we said, we're not leaving until you meet these 7 conditions. And one of them was the naval base. Another one was like, you can't have a public debt, you can't have foreign alliances that might threaten our dominance. You can't like complain about anything we did while we were occupying your country. You have to clean up your cities because infectious diseases could be bad for commerce. And, oh, sorry. So this Platt Amendment really set the stage for saying, okay, we're going to take out our military, but we retain the right to come back in anytime we want for any reason. And then we had ratified a tariff that gave Cuban sugar preference in the US market and protection to select US products in the Cuban market. So, this Treaty of Relations in 1934, US gave Cuba a guaranteed 22% of share of the US sugar market, later amended to a 49% share. So there's all these economic considerations that are kind of behind the scenes in foreign policy that we don't see, that are really what's driving things. Batista. So here's an example of how the US doesn't really care about the quality of life for people in Cuba. It cares about our economic relationship with the Cuban economy. Because we supported this guy, Batista. He was a dictator from 52 to 59. He was a right-wing dictator. He received financial, military, logistic supports from the United States government. He suspended the Constitution, revoked political liberties, including the right to strike. And then, like a lot of right-wingers, he aligned with the wealthiest people he could find, the largest sugar plantations, not just Cubans, but Americans. And the result was gross wealth inequality in Cuba. It reached the point where, US foreigners own 70% of arable land. He negotiated lucrative relationships with the American mafia, controlled drugs, gambling, and prostitution in Havana, and with US-based multinational companies. They're both lucrative business opportunities as far as Batista is concerned. And there was widespread violence, torture, public executions against political enemies. But meanwhile, the poor were really, really suffering in Cuba. And America was happy with this, right? America was supporting this. America saw no problem with this situation, and it would continue to be profitable for us. Chronic unemployment was at 25%. 8% of landowners owned 75% of the land. The bottom fifth took 2% of the national income. US controlled 80% of Cuba's trade. In 1959, about 40% of Cuban sugar land, almost all the cattle ranches, 90% of the mines, 80% of the utilities were owned by American firms. So this is from American foreign policy point of view when things were good, right? This is because we were making money. When things started looking bad from American foreign policy apparatus point of view was when this guy came along and staged a military coup. He took over the refineries that were owned by US corporations Shell and Esso or Exxon. After the US said US wouldn't let them process Soviet oil, so he nationalized them. Then US canceled its imports of Cuban sugar. And then Castro nationalized the US owned assets on the island, including banks and sugar mills. This is what started the sanctions. And the sanctions are now the longest sanctions we've ever imposed on anyone. They started in 1960 after these nationalization acts by Castro. And Eisenhower authorized an overthrow, blah, blah, blah. The mafia was involved. But this embargo is something that started in response to Fidel's economic actions because we couldn't make money in Cuba anymore, right? This is what the problem was from US foreign policy. So as Henry mentioned, the UN has condemned these sanctions every year since 1992. US and Israel, I don't know why Israel, there was some discussion of the chat, I don't know why, but there's, but they consistently vote against these resolutions. This embargo has been condemned by the UN, the Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. And it's just interesting, this article, I think I'll put this in the chat because there's some really interesting discussion from the most recent UN meeting about this. They talk about incalculable damage of these sanctions, prevented critical medicine supplies from reaching Cuba. It says this is the primary obstacle to his country's quest for prosperity and well-being. It's unacceptable that the government of the United States to ignore successive assembly resolutions on this issue. It's neither legal nor ethical for the government of one power to subject a small nation to decades-long economic war aimed at imposing a political system of its own design. So again, why are we doing this? It's not because we want democracy. It's because we want an economy in Cuba that plays ball with our economic system, because that way we stand to make a lot of money. I really think that's what it boils down to. So I'll stop there and open it up to questions or comments. Lindsay had your hand up. Lindsay Matthews.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you now.
Okay, I just wanted to say it was a great talk by Henry. Thank you so much. And I just wanted to add a few things, and because I've been to Cuba many times. And one was in the end, Justin, where you're talking about the financial interests of the United States and Cuba, and that being the wedge between the two countries. I think the biggest threat Cuba poses to the United States is the idea of socialism. And that's something that the Cuban people chose to have in their country, and that's something that should be respected. The other thing I wanted to say is that I take Rhodes Scholar trips. They're really high quality trips to, I've been to Europe, and I had a trip planned for Cuba this year. And I just wanted to say that they offer 4 beautiful trips to Cuba, and you can go and I was supposed to stay in the Nacional Hotel and just roam around. And what we did one time was we rented a car. So I encourage people, go to Cuba, go for a week, rent a car and drive around. And the thing that you'll see is that people carry themselves in a very different way. And they're usually, you can't find a dirty Cuban really, but I think that just us renting a car and driving around and seeing for ourselves gave us an idea of what kind of propaganda we were getting from the US government. So anyway,
Yeah.
Go there and drive around because you can.
Yeah, go see it. And just to be clear, I don't want to look. I believe in like Bernie Sanders said, democratic socialism. I believe in democracy and democratic representation in government and free and fair elections. And I'm not sure that Cuba has all these things, but that doesn't take away the fact that that they have done a lot of economic good for the people and through socialist programs. And I think you're right to some extent. America likes to be able to, doesn't like to have examples of socialism succeeding economically. But I think what we do with Venezuela is we put sanctions on them and try to destroy their economy and then point to it and say, oh, it's socialism that killed the economy, when it was really us.
True.
But, even more fundamentally, my thesis is that, if we can open markets, cleave open the opportunities, as that guy said, that's the purpose of our military might, and we use our economic might for the same goal, to open markets, because that, there's really a lot of money to be made the more markets we can open. But Shelley, you have your hand up.
Yeah, and to some degree, Lindsay just mentioned something that I was going to ask Henry about, which is, can you talk a little bit about, independent of COVID, which right now is keeping us from going anywhere really, but independent of that, what are the travel restrictions, or what are the travel properties right now for an American to go to Cuba?
Well, actually, I don't know that how much that has changed. You can still go, again, keeping in mind the restrictions. You're not supposed to go on vacation. If you go, you put down education, you're going to learn, or you're a journalist, you can put something down. If you're a church organization, you can go. So, trade organization doing something, a union, you can go. So it isn't like we can't go. They're just these barriers that have been put up to make it more complicated. And for example, you're not supposed to spend any money there, any dollars. So this is, of course, that's nonsense. Let me just say something about democracy in Cuba. I think they have a very fine form of democracy, which is different from ours, in which local communities and neighborhoods elect representatives to a certain level, and those levels then elect representatives to higher levels, and ultimately they choose who the government is going to be. So it is not the same the way that we do democracy, and of course the United States is hardly a paradigm of democracy on so many fronts in terms of preventing people from voting. The Cubans recently revised their constitution. They feel that the constitution should reflect current status, and the previous constitution was from many, many years ago. So they just revised it, and they open up, they make these proposals for what the constitutional articles are going to be, and then they open up to the whole country. And everybody gets to, and organizations, trade unions and women's organizations and cultural organizations all get their input. And as a result, the Constitution changes until it comes into a final form. And we don't do that in this country. We have a different form. We elect people we really don't know much about, except through their marketing. Whereas the Cubans elect people they know very well, and they leave it up to them to elect the next level. So they have a different form, but to deny that it's democratic suggests to me that it suggests that we believe that the US form of democracy is the only form. The British have a form of democracy that's different from ours, and so do the Japanese and other countries that we accept. I think that the point you made, Justin, is it's a socialist country, and that whatever form of government it has, that is demonized, and it has to go. So that's and even non-socialist countries, even countries that we might not agree with because they're sectarian, religious based countries like Iran, United States embargoes them too, because it's not under the control of the United States. So the US policy is a little broader than just anti-socialist, although those are the countries that take the brunt of its antagonism.
Well,
but you can definitely travel to, you should be able to travel to Cuba, and the IFCO group is, depending on the pandemic, is planning to take a group with material aid, and they have wonderful relations with different organizations, the Martin Luther King Center and these other organizations within Cuba, where you really get a feel for what's going on. I like I think what Lindsay did is very courageous. It's, especially if you speak Spanish, it's very good. But it also helps. I mean, you get to see all sorts of things by renting a car, just traveling around by foot or bicycle. But it's also really important to get a sense of how things are organized, how the government is organized, but also how people's organizations work, and that I think people should do that. Anyway, my 2 cents.
Yeah, well, I will pass it. I think I saw Patricia's hand up next. I mean, my only thought, Henry, is I don't know how, I don't know, I don't know enough about how democratic Cuba is to really discuss that. I think there is some controversy about that, but I would think we would both agree the larger point is it's not up to us to like punish a country for not being democratic enough. Why would we, and that's collective punishment against the whole people, withholding trade that they need for clean water and for, it's just, you can't justify hurting people in that way because you want to improve their political system. And so I think, and so just to reiterate, even though they tell us that's what they're doing, I think they even had an act in Congress called the Democracy for Cuba Act in the 90s, and it was putting pressure on our allies that we want them to stop doing business with Cuba, or we will not help them with economic aid and things like that. And they called it the Democracy for Cuba Act. And that's BS, right? Our goal is not democracy. The goal of US foreign policy is working at the behest of powerful financial economic interests. And that's the motivation behind the sanctions. And that's what I believe. Lindsay, you want to go ahead?
Yes, I just wanted to add to what Henry
I was first.
in regard to democracy, and that is
Sorry,
that
what?
I wanted to add to something that Henry said about democracy in Cuba being different. One of the reasons it's different is because they have been at war with the United States for 50 years and under an embargo. So it can't possibly function in the same way. It has to choose its own path. The other thing I wanted to add to what Henry said is that, and Justin, you too pointed out what Fidel did. Fidel. Actually, Fidel was one of the leaders, but I've read many books and been there enough to know that he is the person who respects the committees for the committees for the defense of the revolution run that country. They are the neighborhood organizations, as Henry noted, who know and elect the people who go and represent them. And by the way, it's by law 50% women in their Congress. But again, we can't look at Cuba's democracy in the same way we may look at other models, simply because we are not under siege, the United States. So we have a different form, but they are. And I think we have to look at it differently.
Patricia?
As someone who lived through the McCarthyism of the 50s and the Cuban Missile Crisis in the 60s, if we're really trying to understand the motivation for why does the United States stick with this stupid policy? Why does a rich and powerful nation act like it's terrified by this little island of socialism, off its shore? It seems irrational. But I personally, as I, watch what's going on with Afghanistan and all the people bemoaning the loss of a war that never should have been. Personally, my view is there is still a lot of Cold War people out there. All the Clintons and the people around them, there's a whole generation that bought into the war of godless communism against God-fearing capitalism. And they're still stuck in that mindset. And they see the whole world that way. And it is irrational. And it is inhumane, and it should be stopped. The problem is you've got a climate that's collapsing. You're in the middle of a pandemic. How do we make space for Cuba? It should be a small problem capable of a quick resolution, but it's intractable. And so that's why I think it is important to understand the mindset of the people that cannot admit big or small defeats. that they are in some kind of titanic struggle in their minds. And even this tiny little island has to be crushed. That's just my perspective.
Justin, you're muted.
Sorry, yeah, I was muting because my cat was making a lot of noise. Thank you, Patricia. The other Patricia, Vener Saavedra.
Saavedra, yes. You can just call me Patricia with an E kind
Okay,
of sound. So basically I want to answer Patricia, her I don't want to call it argument, except in debate it would be. And you ask how people can be that way with this idea of philosophies, but I don't really think it's the philosophies are really that. I think those philosophies are an excuse, and what it really is greed. And what is greed based on? Fear. Fear is based on greed is based on fear, and greed is what we have to understand is where they're coming from, and they're afraid of losing it all. So it's really, I mean, they could be having a perfect democracy there, Greek and Roman style, I mean, pure democracy, and they'd still find something wrong with it. And they'd still call it, they'd still call it communism or socialism or whatever they wanted to call it. They'd find a reason, they'd find something. And that's all I have to say about that.
yeah, I think it's interesting, when, that these sanctions started, not after we discovered the Russian nuclear missiles in Cuba, it was after that was later. That was years later. The sanctions started after they nationalized the oil refineries, after they nationalized the banks and the plantations and things, after they kicked out the multinationals. That's when the sanctions started, and that's what the sanctions are about. And because in my opinion. Lindsay, did you have another comment?
No, I'm sorry if my hand was up, but
Oh yeah.
thank you.
Justin, I think that it's a good conversation. I think that the comments are absolutely correct, that the United States is not interested in promoting democracy. In my view, it's interested in getting rid of democracies. I mean, if we were interested in promoting democracies, we have a lot of allies in the Middle East that we would overthrow.
Yep.
That are vicious dictatorships. If we were interested in protecting women's rights, the same is true. Democracy is used as a weapon, but it's a pretty weak weapon, and we have to ask ourselves, what kind of democracy do we have when roughly half of the people don't bother to vote because they don't think it's worthwhile, or they can't vote because one state or another put restrictions. In addition, and I think this is something that the Green Party makes a point of, it's very hard to get past the constraints of this two-party system, the Republicans and Democrats, that at least in foreign policy, there's hardly any difference between them. There's some differences domestically, in my view, but I think the Green Party is well aware of how difficult it is. And the idea of ranked choice voting is a way to sort of try to break into this duopoly that runs this country. So I think that it's clear from what everybody has said that we understand democracy is a fake, it's a fake argument. And I agree with you completely, Justin. It's economic. I wanted to say one more thing, and that has to do with, why is the United States so afraid of Cuba, or its way of life, its way of governing? I don't think it's just afraid of Cuba. It was afraid of the Soviet Union, did everything it could to get rid of it. It's afraid of China, is now moving its troops and naval fleets over to the Asia Pacific. That's something that Obama started. recognizing that China is a threat, not a military threat. Anybody who looks at it realizes China is very defensive and spends less than a third of what the US spends on military. But the threat is of a different system, a system in which the state plays a big role. And the United States, from Reagan on, especially overturning the New Deal of Franklin Roosevelt, who basically said if the private corporations don't employ people, the government will. And then, of course, took big actions to make that happen. But any socialist or socialist leaning country is a threat to the economic model that the US bangs people over the head with, which is everything should be private, everything should be deregulated, the government should stay out of everybody's business except, of course, for spying and bombing. You know, the military is the biggest industry in the country. So, but social things. And it's very interesting to me, and I won't say any more, but the recent efforts to put money into infrastructure in this country and spend money on civilian projects in the United States overturns the last 40 years of neoliberal policies in this country. And the Republicans are fighting very hard against it. The Democrats supported these policies of austerity and cutting back on government civilian programs and so forth. Privatization, deregulation, both parties supported that. So it's interesting that what's happening is that the Chinese model in particular, I would say, of rapid economic growth, even in the pandemic, has scared the United States far more than Cuba scares the United States. But the United States isn't willing to accept a Cuba or a Venezuela or a Nicaragua, or even milder forms in Syria or the strange form in North Korea. But anything where the state plays a role and the country does not abide by whatever the US muscle says, then it's a threat. In particular, these socialist or socialist leaning countries.
Yeah, I would agree, and it leads me to, I think of the multinational corporations kind of running a lot of foreign policy, and what they care about is their freedom, right? It's not freedom for people, it's freedom for them to operate their business the way they want to operate their business. What they want from the state is for the state to stay out of their business, so to speak. And
But still take our money from it.
Yes.
what?
Still take our taxpayer dollars.
Right.
Of it.
Yeah.
Right.
Their own kitty, their personal kitty.
Yeah. And so, and here in America, they figured out a way to kind of accomplish that. I mean, there's democracy, but we need more of a democratic revolution in this country. I'm not calling for a violent revolution, but I think we need a democratic revolution to call up and call on our government to assert its rightful powers of regulating industry and making sure that that people and individuals' rights are protected. And that's in healthcare, that's in energy. We're suffering the side effects of a greedy oil industry that doesn't care what it's doing to our environment. And the U.S. government is laissez-faire, right? And they've achieved this over years of kind of propaganda and like selling the American public on this idea that freedom for them means jobs for us, means prosperity for us, but it doesn't always mean prosperity for us. It can mean very serious negative consequences with what we do to the environment, and leaving leaving these multinational corporations free to influence our government to act on their behest to try and free the world for them, to make the world safe for their business, has blowback consequences for us, because our government is out there being bullies in a lot of senses to, as I quoted that Navy officer, cleave the path open for American business. We make some enemies that way. And, I really hope the American people are going to increasingly take a look at our foreign policy and demand that it reflect our values. We have, American people, like most people I know are good people. And if they knew a lot of the things that are being done in our names, they wouldn't really be happy about it. And I think these sanctions are just one example of many of where, our policy is causing real human suffering. And the excuses given for why we're doing this are not the real reasons for why it's being done. And more people understand that. Hopefully, the more pressure we can put on our leaders to end these unnecessary sanctions and help enrich the lives of humans in Cuba, which we have no right to be bullying and imposing suffering upon. And I don't know, Savannah, I think we're maybe about concluded, unless anyone has any final thoughts. Lindsay?
I just want to say one thing, because I've been listening to Professor Richard Wolff a lot these days. And one of the things he says is that capitalism, the problems that capitalism has created, like permanent homelessness, permanent hunger, and those kinds of social things, which you just alluded to, Justin. Capitalism created these problems, and it doesn't have built into it the ability to solve them either. Capitalism is not going to turn around and solve the problem of homelessness, hunger, the environment, number one. They're not going to do it. We already see this. But I do believe that there are new structures in our society that are raising people up that we need to be aware of and to support. We have permanent food banks now. They're permanent. And if we can see these things as structures with the potential to raise a lot of people up, I think it's a good thing, because we're going to have to support people and to support the things that capitalism is not going to do anything about except make worse. But there is to me, a lot of hope.
Yeah.
And the pandemic has brought out a lot of good in a lot of people. So anyway.
Yeah, capitalism won't solve those problems, right? Because there's no profit in it. There's no profit in ending homelessness, but there's a public interest in it, and there's a human interest in it. And that's what we have to express that interest when we vote, and see to it that our government manifests that interest, so to speak. Well, thanks everybody again. Henry,
Yes,
I want to
Thank you.
Henry, I want to thank you again personally for coming to speak to us tonight.
Thank you, Justin, and all the folks. Justin, I think you made a tremendous contribution pulling stuff together, and complimenting what I said really well. So thank you for doing that. I think it's a pleasure to be able to talk some of these things over.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you, Henry, and thank you to everyone. There was a question if we can have the slides available. So we'll post those to our website along with this recording onto our YouTube, which is linked to our website too at some point, maybe this weekend. Yes, I just wanted to thank Henry again and Justin, and just put in our donation link one more time. And I guess we'll see everyone next month for the next Q&A, which is still TBD, but we'll figure that out soon. Okay, so thanks everyone. Mask up and have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.